Hello, everyone. Welcome to Censored2Celebrated. My name is Melita Noël Cantú. It is May 2015. I'm super happy to be here. It's a really rainy day here in Austin, which is great news for us. I'm hoping that everybody who needs rain is getting it, and everybody who needs sun is getting that. So it's a good day to be talking about cultural competency with my guest, Alaina Szlachta. Here she is. Hi, Alaina.
Hello,
good to
everyone.
See you. And I'm excited about it because there's been so much in the news around diversity and cultural competency, and what does this really mean, and how do we look at cultural competency around diverse sexuality and gender? So that's something that Alaina has been working on for her PhD. She is a sexuality researcher at UT Austin, and so yeah, we're going to get to hear a lot about how she's thinking about this and how people in the field who are doing this research are thinking about this. Hello to oh, we got some folks joining us. Great. Please let me know. This is a new computer for me, as some of you know, and I'm doing different things with the mic. So let me know if you can't hear me or Alaina. We think we're pretty good, but let us know. And before we go any further, I want to just let you know a little bit more about my guest. Alaina Szlachta has her master's in education and has her PhD.C. And she balances the worlds of academia with the private sector. So as a sexuality researcher at the University of Texas at Austin, here in Austin where I am as well, she evaluates adolescent sexual health interventions. And her latest study investigated the behaviors of culturally responsive sexuality educators. And that's something she and I have talked quite a bit about, so I'm excited to go more in depth with actual interview questions. And as a cultural competence curriculum developer and trainer, Alaina works with organizations to provide professional development and strategic planning. So she's kind of working in both the worlds, and I know she's done a lot with community organizing and has that background as well, and we'll hear more about that today. So welcome, Alaina. Thanks so much again for being here. As you know, we are the warm-up question is about the alphabet soup, and every time I think this question is not relevant anymore, I talk to my guests in our tech check-in and I say, what do you think? Is this still relevant in your work around diverse sexuality and gender? Do you use any version of what is called the alphabet soup, which is the LGBTQQIA, maybe could be longer. So kind of what's the most accepted alphabet soup in your work, Alaina? What do you find most useful and applicable in the environments you're working with and the colleagues you're working with?
So it's a wonderful question, and it's a question that I feel like I don't have one best practices answer for, with the exception of there are many terms. There's an infinite number of terms that you could use to represent diverse sexuality and gender, and my sort of strategy for figuring out what's the most appropriate term or what's the most appropriate language to use is depending on the population that I'm working with. And of course, I don't have all the answers in terms of which population prefers which terms. And so, of course, I use the healthy curiosity approach, and I just ask people, you know, I know there are multiple pronouns out there. There are multiple ways to refer to the communities that you identify with. Can you tell me which terms you prefer, which communities you belong to? And then I use the language of the individuals or the groups that I'm working with and sort of mirror that. And that is also something that I've heard recently from other wonderful groups that I've worked with. And so I know it's a strategy that I'm not the only one who's using. And it's a way to also get to know the people you're working with too, especially if you're in clinical settings where you only have 15 to 20 minutes to work with a patient, or if you're, like I spent many years as a sexuality educator, you only have an hour or 50 minutes if you're lucky to do a training that you've been asked to do by a school. And so to ask folks questions like that helps to build a relationship in a small period of time by getting to know what they prefer and what their experiences are.
And that makes a lot of sense, and I guess I wonder what happens when you can't ask them. So in terms of your writing, is there, in academia, is there kind of a preferred term that you've experienced versus when you were a sexuality educator not in an academic setting? What's the difference there?
So I think it's important to think about that too, in terms of there are many ways in which, or many circumstances in which you might not be able to ask somebody that question, and a great circumstance is the issue of safety. I can't go into a high school group or even a high school auditorium and ask people because there's too many folks. Or if I were to ask that question and have people raise their hands, I could be creating a potentially unsafe environment. So I think that's a really great thing to keep in the back of your mind, is when might not it be safe to ask people what terms they prefer, because that might be outing them in a way that they've never done before. So I think you have to kind of go with your gut in terms of when is it the appropriate time to ask people. Of course, if you're doing clinical work and you are doing a one-on-one session, that's a more appropriate and it's a safe space already. And so that's a great way to connect with someone. But it's not always appropriate to do that. And I think, again, you just kind of have to go with my gut and my intuition in terms of asking that question. And the replacement term for that would be just to acknowledge right away that there are a lot of terms that people might use to describe diverse sexuality and gender, and this is the term that I'm going to choose for this particular moment. And then I could say, I'm just going to talk about diverse sexuality and gender, or the gender spectrum, or the sexual orientation spectrum, but to clarify with people that, you know, there are many different ways you can think about this, you can talk about it, and this is the term I'm going to use today, but it's not the only one.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, I know you're really always thinking about that cultural competency piece, so that's a way to start our conversation around that. So tell us how you got into this work around the cultural competency with diverse sexuality and gender. What's your path been like?
So there are two sort of answers to that question. The first is, how did I become a Widener University student going into one of the very select number of PhD programs that address human sexuality? And the initial response for me was, I don't know, 8 years ago, and I wanted to make a career transition, and I realized I wanted to become a PhD, I wanted to be a teacher, I wanted to develop expertise in something. And I figured, what would be that something that I would never get bored investigating and teaching and talking about for the rest of my life? And so human sexuality was that thing for me that I knew I would never entirely become bored with that wonderful, diverse, broad topic. So that's what directed me into the area of human sexuality. The cultural competence piece was a little bit more complicated and didn't come until later on in my graduate career. And I was someone who worked full-time and went to school, and I uprooted myself from one community to another to actually be able to go to graduate school. And so I balanced a number of factors. And in the middle of my graduate program, I had a wonderful professor who asked each one of my colleagues in my class to take a cultural competence assessment, which is called the Intercultural Development Inventory. It's the assessment that I actually used in my doctoral research and will continue to use both in private practice and academic work. And I realized after getting the results of my assessment that while I've traveled the world and I've lived in many different communities and worked with different kinds of people, that my cultural competence was not really all that high. And it was this aha moment in terms of, well, what will it take for me to develop cultural competence? And so that's something that I decided I would embark on a journey for. And that's led me to the research that I do and the private practice work that I have as well. And I do see this question, what does a PhD.C mean? So it's an abbreviated way of saying that I am a PhD candidate. I am someone, however, who is about to defend my dissertation, so I've already collected all of my data, I've analyzed it, I've written everything, I'm about to publish it, and I will be defending my dissertation sometime in June. So the C is a way for me to say I am almost done with my very long 5-year process. I believe that folks who have defended their exams are also PhD candidates, but they're just beginning on the dissertation process, where I'm at the very tail end. And so the abbreviation is a way to make that distinction. Good question.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. I want to get to our next question, and I know we have really interesting comments happening, so I'll weave them in as I'm able. What are you currently doing in the field? What are you really passionate about right now with this work?
Well, so I have two things going on. One is my work at the University of Texas at Austin, and I work there part-time. I also work part-time for Joanne Consulting, and so I get to balance anywhere from 30 to 60 hours a week working, depending on what's going on. My work at the University of Texas is with the School of Nursing, and I get to do adolescent sexual health intervention evaluation. And in particular, I'm looking at a number of factors in curriculum and programs targeted towards African American and Mexican American young women. and what components are really making a difference in terms of reducing HIV and improving safer sex practices. And of course, with my interest and passion regarding cultural competence, anytime there's an intervention that talks about being culturally tailored or culturally responsive, I immediately start to compile a list of, well, how are they defining that? Are they defining that? And what I'm finding, which is very interesting and makes this a complex area, is that there are numerous different ways that people define culturally tailored interventions or culturally responsive interventions, sometimes with the use of theory, sometimes with just personal experience or going off the experience of previous interventions. And something that I look forward to diving deeper into is how do we take something like cultural competence and make it measurable and assess it long term to determine, well, if there are numerous ways to be culturally responsive, what's the way that's going to produce the best result in terms of the behavioral outcomes or the attitudinal or knowledge outcomes we're searching for? So that's a long answer to that question. I do very similar work in the private practice or in the private sector in terms of working with associations, organizations, nonprofits, and assessing the behaviors and the outcomes they experience in their organizations in terms of meeting the needs of a diverse clientele or being able to recruit and retain diverse team members, clients, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different components that you can assess, and figuring out a way to do that sustainably and to do it in a way that's efficient and that can be replicated is really important, and it's part of the process I'm working on.
Well, what's really interesting, and we have a great question from Sally that I'm going to put up in a minute, but it's so complicated. How do we deal with the complexity of this where we want to include, but we don't want to alienate, but then it makes it hard to have common language. So here's the question from Sally. Let me try to get it back up there again. Here's my complaint. Some Western USA people are so intent on being seen as unique and an individual that many resist any labels. I'm particularly seeing this with youth. I don't know if that's what you're seeing as well, Sally, but that's where I'm seeing it a lot, even when the labels do apply. So this both confuses the issues and alienates many people. Example, what do you call someone who enjoys sex with both males and females or any gender? What are they called? What would be the term for that person? So it's a good question.
Yeah, I want to answer that by talking about the sort of theoretical approach that I use with cultural competence, because I think it's a good starting place and it addresses the language issue. And I'm not somebody who believes in universal approaches. I don't think that they're appropriate in all contexts. And I think that a universal approach, whether it's with a curriculum or whether it's deciding this is the term I'm going to use and assume it's going to be appropriate, that to me is a universal approach that doesn't necessarily work well or meet the needs of whoever you're talking with. The theory that I work with is called the intercultural development continuum. It was developed from, what was the original theory? The developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. Those are both theories that are available for folks if they want to research them on Google. The premise of that theory is simply that when we talk about cultural competence is simply the ability to both understand difference and identify ways to create commonality. And so underneath all of that are similarities and differences. And so in terms of cultural competence, it's about how do we deal with difference and how do we do that well. And sometimes, I think Sally's question is a good one, that we can make it convoluted by focusing on what's the appropriate language, when that can be a real distraction. And it's an important factor, but it's not the only factor. And a lot of it has to do with how do we as individuals deal with difference, because we all have different experiences in our lives and we develop different values, we develop different perspectives, expectations, and that difference exists everywhere, and it is complex. But how do we deal with it when we're in the face of someone who's different from us in that moment, working with an individual or a group? And that's where the developmental opportunity is simply dealing with difference. And that's a balance between seeing that difference exists, but there's also commonality between us too. So how do we make that balance? And that's the sort of theoretical approach that I use. And I know that some folks think that's overly simplistic, but it's just a stepping stone, and it's a stepping stone that develops our self-awareness, our self-confidence, and the ability to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations.
And is this, would your theory, would it be about engaging in that conversation and learning how to engage in the conversation to try to work with some of that difference and finding commonality as well? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that commonality is a stepping stone of creating connection. But if all we focus on is the ways in which we are common or the experiences that we share, then we're not able to develop those in-depth relationships that are based on the differences that are also present in our experiences. And so getting it back to that language question, that language changes and molds, and in the 1970s, language around diverse sexuality and gender was very different from the way that it is today, and that's always changing. And so I think to become comfortable with the fact that there's never going to be one term that fits all, that's part of the being comfortable with the uncomfortable, being comfortable not knowing all the answers. And in fact, I know you're going to ask me this at some other point, but I'll just say that one of the aha moments I've had in my own training and in my own experience working with people is that I don't have all the answers. I'm an expert, but I'm not an expert, and I'm always learning from people, and that's part of the fun of it, is just being able to say, hey, I don't have all the answers. I'm not sure what's the best approach, so why don't we work together to figure that out? And so sometimes if you're having a conversation with a young person, it's learning the terms that they like. Where did you learn that from? Okay, I can use that term too, but not necessarily holding on to that term as the best one. It's about being flexible and dancing and getting to know people, and that can be really fun. And it's also letting go of this, I have to have the right answer or the right approach. There's a lot of relief in that. And like I said earlier, a healthy sense of curiosity is really a great place to start, and getting to know difference and what language is appropriate and when is it not, and dancing with that.
You absolutely did go to my aha moment question, so thank you. Thanks for just taking care of that. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned there's a really good term that we should be Googling about cultural competency. What's the term that would be a great one for people to plug into Google? And
well, if you're interested in the theories that I mentioned, there are two. The original theory is the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. There's a couple of articles written by Bennett that you could find. And then the newer version of that, which is associated with this assessment tool that I use, the theory is the intercultural competence continuum, that talks about a continuum that we as human beings live on as we grow and develop and learn new cultures and experience differences and identify commonalities. There's a continuum that we kind of float back and forth on that kind of talks about cultural competence, what that looks like. In terms of some Google terms that you could find, you'd be very, you could spend a lot of time just Googling cultural competence. There's a lot of resources out there. One of the things that the work that I do with Jelani Consulting, one of the terms or particular components of cultural competence that we work with is the idea of unconscious bias. And that's there's a lot of resources out there that, there's a book, in fact, I have it on my bookshelf, I'm going to look, it's called Blind Spot. And it's a really great way of talking about our biases with regard to race and gender and sexual orientation and multiple different kinds of things. That it's a human nature to have bias, and that's okay. But to just stop there and go, oh yeah, I have bias, but to not explore that in more depth, that's the difference between sort of the universal approach to we all have biases versus no, let me go a little bit deeper and see what those biases are and how they affect the work that I do every day. So Blind Spot's a good book. It approaches that conversation in a sort of neutral way that can be accessible for some folks who find this topic to be very sensitive. But it's not the only resource, but it is a good one.
Okay. And who was the author again on Blind Spot? I think I missed.
There are two very long names that I'm going to butcher, but I guarantee you if you were to just type in the book Blind Spot, you'd be able to find it. It was published pretty recently.
Great. Okay, cool. We're getting a lot of interesting questions here, so I'm going to pull in one before we keep going with our questions. We have 10 minutes, so that's fantastic.
It's surprising how much 30 minutes can go by, how quickly, I know.
Yes, it is. So here, let's bring up Sally's question. In fact, if everyone who could be or is attracted to more than one gender would claim and agree on the label, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, those who are exclusively homosexual or heterosexual would be seen as not having a choice. As long as bisexual people occasionally take on the label of heterosexual or gay or lesbian, that is very confusing to heterosexuals who see all sexual orientation identities as a choice. Interesting.
So I have a little moment I'll share with you to address that comment, and I think it's a good one.
Great.
So I recently did a training with a group of United Methodists. It was the United Methodist community, and they wanted a cultural competence training, and there was a woman in the group, and we were talking about this very topic about heterosexuality, and I said that the underlying assumption for heterosexuals who haven't thought about diverse sexuality and gender is that everybody is heterosexual and everybody has these opposite sex attractions, and that one of the frightening things for people who haven't thought outside of the norm for them, which is that maybe same-sex attraction or heterosexual attraction, you have to actually think differently about heterosexuality if you're really going to accept anything outside of heterosexuality. And when I say think differently, I simply mean that you have to accept that heterosexuality isn't the only value or the only worldview or the only lifestyle that exists. And when it comes to cultural competence, when you're sort of at just a beginning stage of cultural competence, when you're beginning to embark on that journey, you might see the world through your value systems and not even acknowledge that any other value systems exist. So for folks who assume that heterosexuality is the norm, it's because maybe they don't have a lot of experience or don't want to accept that there are actually other choices and lifestyles out there. And there are other languages to describe. There are multiple different kinds of lifestyles, values, attractions that are out there, and I don't think language can capture them all. And so I don't think that getting stuck on words is a good place to go, but simply to understand that there are multiple different value systems out there. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Rain is making the point of that Blind Spot sounds like a very good book and resource to allow a person to see where their biases are affecting their decisions and viewpoints.
Absolutely.
And I'm really glad to get that comment. Thank you, Rain. Alaina, I am now hoping that you'll tell us a moment that you've really felt that shift from feeling censored to celebrated around something in this area.
So I want to take us down a semi-complex road before I get to the sort of happy ending, because I think that they exist at the same time. So the work that I've been doing at the University of Texas has been very eye-opening, and as it is one of my, I was a teacher for a long time, and so now I'm being involved in academia from a more research-oriented perspective. And with the evaluations that I've been doing, I've been finding that there might be a numerous amount of interventions or programs that do make a difference around reducing HIV, around increasing parent-child communication, which also can mediate risky sexual behavior. There are numerous interventions that make a difference out there. What I'm finding is that there's a lack of sustainability around, once we as researchers find that yes, this intervention works and does make a difference, how do we then take it outside of the world of academia and place it sustainably into communities that could really use these resources? And so it's a question that I just want to hold out there, and I think my philosophy around developing cultural competence is helping us to think differently about things. And so this particular aha moment for me around the work that I'm doing is really investigating, well, what does it mean to implement sustainable education around sexuality? What does that look like, and how do we deal with the funding issue? And is it even a funding issue? Is it a political issue? Right? There's so many things, and I know that we could talk for hours about that. But ultimately, it's the question that came up for me that helps me think differently about the way that we might do research. And there's a big shift that's happening. Folks who are in the world of academia probably know about community-based participatory research, which is, instead of having the ivory tower of research, it's working with community groups to find a way to immediately identify how do we sustainably implement this intervention. So anyway, it's a sort of full circle moment that I've had. And back to your question about censored to celebrated, is that I love when I have the opportunity to think differently about something. And so there are books out there, Blind Spot being one of them, helps me think differently about the way that I understand bias and how it affects our everyday interactions, the work that we do. And this is a silly sort of example to provide, but I'm going to provide it anyway. I've recently been really into this book. It's called The 4-Hour Work Week, and it has nothing to do with sex, and it has nothing to do with diverse sexuality and gender. But for me, this particular book has helped me to think differently about the way that I live my life, the way that I work, the way that I interact with other people, and how much time do I want to devote to the things that I do to make money versus the things that I do that I'm passionate about. I bring this up only because the opportunity to help you not only identify what are the perspectives I commonly rely on to live my life, and then how might I be able to pick another perspective or another way of thinking that might actually make my life a whole lot better. That's part of diversity. That's part of understanding cultural competence and taking it back to diverse sexuality and gender. I love the book tour that you're doing because I think that there's so many resources out there that are available to help people think differently about the world, and providing those opportunities for yourself as often as possible to help you think outside of the box. That's what develops our cultural competence. It also helps us to get to know other perspectives and get to know what pushes our buttons too, in terms of, wow, that really pushes my buttons with the values that I've had my whole life. That's great. To understand where your buttons get pushed, that's part of growth and development, because then it helps you to see, well, how have I made choices in terms of the people I hang out with or the assumptions I make about them that are all based on these values. So anyway, if you have the opportunity to pick up something and read it, to watch a movie, to go to a community event that's something you've never done before, and maybe it terrifies you a little bit, or maybe you fundamentally don't agree with it, do those things, because that's part of the growth opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. We did an experiment where it was about finding a stretch opportunity in our community at the nonprofit I worked at, specifically around sexuality or gender, and it was fascinating. It was challenging, even for me, who has this real passion for this area. I was surprised to find out what made me feel like I was stretching and growing and needing to challenge myself. So I appreciate that. And that kind of, for me, tell me the name of the book again one more time, because I know this has been really inspiring for you.
Oh, the book that has made me think differently. And this is about where I'm at in my life. So I don't know how many of you are sort of in a midlife crisis or early life crisis around their career, but I'm being someone who's transitioning out of the student work because I have to into let me choose a profession that I love and that also provides financial sustainability. I've been thinking a lot about that. So this particular book is called The 4-Hour Work Week, and it's all about basically an efficient lifestyle. How do we create efficient lifestyle so that we can spend more time with our children, so that we can engage in the things that we love versus just engaging in things that we feel like we have to pay the bills. In fact, there's a whole other way of thinking about that. And this author, Tim Ferriss, he talks about that. And I will say, as a critique to that the way that he writes, it's a book that's accessible to a certain group of people, mostly middle-class people. And so I'm a little frustrated by that, because I think it might have the effect of furthering the economic disparity, and his book doesn't give those opportunities or address the real reality of some folks that can't make those choices in terms of work. But for those of us who have the luxury of being able to do that, this book is a good resource.
Fantastic. Wow. That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up and just kind of, again, acknowledging the complexity that comes with this lens of cultural competency, diverse sexuality and gender. It's gray, it's complex, and it's great to talk to you about it more. I know we've had a lot of conversations since you moved here to Austin. It's been fantastic. And I want to just honor that we are at 1:31, and so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. But what's the best way for people to keep connecting with you if they have more questions? And of course, we'll be going to our after-party chat in just a moment. Alaina, for joining us. We've gotten some really great feedback. Thank you for everybody who's made comments today. We've got great comments from Sally and Rain and Andrew and Jessica. So thanks all for joining us, and everybody who didn't comment but has been witnessing. We appreciate you being here. We celebrate you. And we are going to go into the green room, and I'm going to email everyone who is joining us in the after-party chat. For everybody who's not able to stay or join us or hasn't RSVP'd, we'll see you next time. Until we see you, June 2nd will be my next one, because I'm going on the tour starting June 13th. So I'm doing an early interview in June, and that should be really exciting, and you'll hear a little bit more about what I'm doing with the tour. And until we meet again, just celebrate all the people in your life. And for those of you joining us, we'll see you in a minute or two. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Right. Bye. Bye, Alaina. Thank you.